Welcome into another edition of Carp's Corner, as we're going to break down some of the big stories and big things that are happening here in college football and a little bit of the NFL this week. Touch on Georgia and Bama, kind of where they're at. We'll break down that Penn State-Iowa matchup and what that could mean. Dive into the Red River Shootout as well. And then, a little bit of UGA and Auburn. A game that looked probably a lot bigger a while ago, but there are still some ramifications, and that'll kind of take us back to Bama and Georgia at the top. And then also situation down in Jacksonville with Urban Meyer, what's to be done about that, and maybe a more measured approach to potentially look at it when you look at the entirety of the landscape and what it potentially means. And then also, there's some big mid-season releases in the NFL, which you typically don't see, of Stephon Gilmore and Jalen Smith. So when you see Gilmore and Smith getting released, two really talented players at one point in time in their careers, what does it mean? And are the situations similar? Because I don't really think they are. But I wanted to start off with Bama, Georgia initially. And everybody's just lumping these two schools together. And maybe rightfully so at this point, but just wanted to take a little pause because I kind of did this initially too. And I looked at Bama, said, okay, we know what they are. We know what they've been. We know what they've done. All right. They've got a good young quarterback. This defense is humming. They have a nice win over Ole Miss. They destroyed Miami. They've looked their usual dominant self. But Georgia, on the other hand, they have the nice win against Clemson. What has that win turned out to look like? Well, we think Georgia's defense is really good. And I believe that we know Georgia's defense is really good. They're going against a really good Clemson defense. Clemson's offense obviously struggled and has really struggled since then. But I don't know, and I've said this for a number of times, and it's a big if because you have to have the horses up front. But if you can slow down Georgia's rushing attack enough and find a way to put some points and play from ahead, which is tough against their defense, mind you, not going to be something that's easy. I'm not fully convinced that this Georgia offense is well-rounded enough and their passing attack is where it needs to be able to be a national championship caliber offense. They can pound the rock, with the combinations of, Stetson Bennett and JT Daniels. JT's been beat up, hasn't played, was out last game. I mean, is he healthy? Will he be ready to go? And so I have to bifurcate those two programs right now. I'm going to say we've got Bama sitting there alone at the top, and they've shown us what they show us every year, a dominant team that goes out and executes each and every week. But Georgia, I think, is close to that, but I can't put them there until I watch somebody try to start to slow down their run game, and maybe nobody ever does until they play Bama potentially in the title game. But we've been so quick to kind of anoint everybody, whether it's been A&M, whether it was Ole Miss earlier this year, whether it was Florida before their loss to Kentucky. And, all of those teams, have kind of been beaten up in a bad way in a game thus far. And I think there's a lot of flawed teams this year in college football. So I don't know if it's safe outside of Bama, who has proven it, and they've proven it year in and year out. That's why I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Kirby Smart's proven to me he can kind of get there and he can be around it and he can be a great defensive coach and they can run the football. And when they have, pretty decent quarterback, they can, have a good passing game. I don't know if they have that quarterback, and I really don't know if they have the weapons right now on the outside until some, they start to improve a little bit and get some guys back and get healthy. And then they're still going to have to prove it to me. And so with that, we'll go to some of these big games in college football this week. And the biggest game to me is going to be Penn State traveling out to Iowa City to take on Iowa Hawkeyes. You have 4 versus 3. And I was a little bit like Georgia in the fact that they play great defense. They run the football really well. Petrus, their quarterback's been good. He was much better against Maryland, but they thrive on the fact that they can turn the football over. They can stop the run and they can get after you defensively. That sets up their offense to be in advantageous situations. Conversely, start talking about Penn State, and what they're able to do. And when Sean Clifford's been on, they've been really good, and he's played really well this year. Hasn't really turned the football over. He's made the big plays down to Jahad Dotson. They've been able to throw it intermittently fairly well. I think their defense is really talented and very, very good, but I just don't necessarily I don't trust their running game fully the same way that I don't trust Iowa's passing game. And so I think Penn State could have a full day's work on their hands if they can't make big plays in the running game or in the passing game. That is what's kind of allowed them to have success. And with Dotson being a guy who's probably a first round talent at wide receiver, and Sean Clifford doesn't turn the ball over, that's what's allowed them to have success. Iowa's going to challenge them up front. They're going to try to eliminate that run game, and I think that they will for the most part. All of this is going to fall back onto Sean Clifford. It'll be a raucous environment. It'll be a tough place to play. Kinnick Stadium, very, very difficult. Only stadium I've never won in the Big Ten. Very, very tough place to play. And this Iowa team is believing. And a lot of times in sports, belief is half the battle. I'm inclined to take Iowa in this game and think that they're able to win this thing. I think Penn State's a more talented team. And I believe that's not just me saying this is recruiting over the last 3 to 5 years. If you look at the rankings, you'll see that Iowa has not performed at the same level, but they do develop their players really well. They have a firm identity, and you know what they're going to bring to the table. With that being said, this Penn State team, they found a way to pull it out against Auburn. They found a way to pull one out at Camp Randall against Wisconsin, who, despite Wisconsin's struggles, their defense was still really good. A defense that's kind of the same caliber as Iowa's, a little bit different in how they play the game, but very, very similar in their ability to execute and what they're going to be able to do. So Penn State having that big road win for me, I think that's going to push me over the top. And I'm going to probably lean on the fact that I think Sean Clifford's been good and he's matured enough and he's playing at a high enough level now that I think Penn State ultimately gets this win. I think it is a close game. I don't see a blowout either side unless somehow Iowa, they've got that horseshoe stuck up their rear again and they can just have a turnover machine to start the game, which I don't see happening. But outside of that, I think Penn State pulls it out in a close one, very, very close, nail biter in my opinion, but that's great for college football. It's going to be highly entertaining. First top 5 matchup in the Big Ten that didn't include Ohio State or Michigan in over 50, 60 years. I mean, I think the last one was in the 50s. So you're pushing almost 70 years with this. So it's great to see some parity at the top of the Big Ten. That's fantastic. The OU Texas Red River shootout, this weekend, you got Spencer Rattler one side, you got Bijan Robinson. I mean, can they run the ball? Can Texas run the ball enough against an improved Oklahoma defense to be able to keep Spencer Rattler off the field? And it looked last week against Kansas State that OU's finally got this offense rolling a little bit, finally scoring 30 points. Defense obviously wasn't quite as good as they've been, but it looks like the offense is in a better place. But this could be the first loss for Oklahoma. They've struggled a little bit this year, and they haven't looked like their normal dominant selves. If they lose, I think that whole Big 12 could potentially be up in the air. With everything moving forward. And I think it could also jeopardize Oklahoma's spot in the college football playoff because you have Cincinnati now with their victory against Notre Dame lurking, waiting for one of these Power 5 conferences to struggle. And we saw it last week with Oregon, Stanford. OU, if you want to make the college football playoff, don't become this week's victim in the Red River shootout. Big rivalry game. Fired up about it, and that should be another one that should be a high quality atmosphere and should be rocking down there in Texas. And then the last game to kind of look at a little bit is Georgia Auburn. Auburn was supposed to be great this season, pretty good this season. They went up. Bo Nix hasn't played well. They went up to Penn State. They lost that game. Some calls, iffy calls that maybe kept it a little closer than what it should have been or potentially could have been. The best teams in this rivalry matchup don't always win. And Auburn, I feel like, has the horses up front to potentially slow that running game of Georgia. I don't know if they can score enough points offensively. They're a little bit offensively stunted. Bo Nix, but here's the thing about him. When he plays well, he can catch fire. And he's a streaky player. They've got the game. I believe it's at Auburn. They'll have Georgia coming into town. This will be kind of a make or break, for them. If they win this game, I think Auburn have tons of momentum, pushing into the rest of the SEC, their schedule, and potentially maybe being able to challenge Bama in the West. I don't think that happens, but I think this is maybe the truest test that we'll get to see Georgia maybe have to use that passing game. But for that to happen, I think Auburn can slow the running attack enough, but they have to score points. And I don't know. I can't get behind it to see if Bo Nix will be able to lead that offense enough to be able to possess the ball, drive it down the field, and to score some points. So I don't necessarily see that happening, but I do want to see if Georgia can get challenged a little bit. And if JT Daniels, who I think is going to be the starter this week, if he can find a way to get that running game going, or that passing attack going rather, if the running game doesn't necessarily produce at a super high level, and they have to find a way to get some points in there. I'd love to see it be a shootout between Nix and JT Daniels. I don't foresee that happening, but I do think this is the best chance to challenge that Georgia running attack. So that'll be interesting to watch. Some news out of the NFL a little bit. 2 guys released. You have Stephen Gilmore, who is released from Buffalo, or really was at Buffalo, now with the New England Patriots, was released from there, was on the PUP list. I mean, this has been a back and forth. They pushed money into his salary last year. He wanted a new deal. And when you're dealing with Bill, sometimes he's just not going to budge on things. He's going to assign value to what he believes you are and what position he believes you're playing. And that value is going to hold, and it's going to be what it's going to be. And I feel like this finally came to a head in Gilmore's, release request. It's thanking the craft, the fans, organization, the coaches. Never explicitly mentions Bill. So I feel like that may have soured a little bit between the two of them. But you look at potential landing spots, it's going to be interesting on what he wants. He's been compensated pretty well by New England. I think he'd be in line for a big deal this offseason. I don't know how many teams that are contenders actually have money now. And so that's the argument that he's going to have to look at within himself. How bad do I really want to win versus how much do I want to get paid? Because it's been reported he either wants, $5 million to kind of make the last half of his season, 2/3 of his season full with his contract, or potentially a longer term deal, which maybe you could push some money out and defer. But you look at, he came from Buffalo. They're a very talented team. You could potentially use some help there. Because I think anybody could use him. The Kansas City Chiefs definitely could. Their cap situation, a little tenuous. Could they bring him in? Tampa Bay, people have thrown out. They need help in the secondary mightily. They just brought in Richard Sherman, to see land there. I don't think he's going to any of those teams for more than a couple $1 million a year, maybe even vet minimum, but you have a chance to win. Maybe the 49ers, and so there'll be other places I think that could offer him more money and potentially that longer term deal. But if you play well and you go to a winning team, your chance to make a playoff run, I think then you can get that big deal in the offseason. Now it's betting on yourself a little bit, which is, what he didn't want to do. He wanted to have his contract extended right now, or maybe even more money into this year. And so I don't know if he'd be really apt to possibly take that, but it is an option. And that's going to have to be where he decides. And, I like to do the proverbial box checking. What is important to you, the priorities in your life? Location, it's a team, it's a family situation, winning, the guys you're playing with, and you have to prioritize those. And we'll see basically what it is for Gilmore as he makes his decision here, because he's going to have a lot of suitors. Just about every team would love him. It's can they afford him and how good are they? You juxtapose that with Jalen Smith, who was released in Dallas, their formerly star linebacker. He comes in. It's a great story, him blowing out his knee against Ohio State. He battles back, plays really well, gets the big contract. He just wasn't playing good football this year. And so Dallas cut him. They're going to pay him $7 million, the balance of his salary. But he had injury protection for, 8.5 to 9 next season. And it's pretty telling where Dallas looks at this and says, hey, we need to get him off our books. We'll eat the money this year in a year where they're competing and they're probably going to win the NFC East. Now, I don't know if they're Super Bowl contenders in Dallas, but they're probably going to make the playoffs. And so you're cutting a player who was still playing for you. But it's reports were that they didn't think he could help contribute. And they really were worried potentially of something happening in the future where they would ultimately have to pay out that money and be guaranteed and would be punitive to them against the cap next season. So I think Jalen Smith gets picked up. Unless he's able to find a little bit of his youth, I don't think that he's going to be able to have much of a future, maybe outside this year or potentially next year in the NFL. And some of his, highest earning days, are obviously behind him. Now, lastly, I want to touch on Urban Meyer and everything that's happened in Jacksonville, or happened in Columbus rather, but with regard to the Jacksonville Jaguars. And there's been a lot of people that have called for his head. If Shad Khan wants to fire him, that's his prerogative. If he thinks that he can no longer do the job as head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, it's between Urban Meyer Shad Khan and and his organization, because he's the owner. He's the ultimate guy that makes the decisions. If he thinks this will hurt the PR and the community and people will no longer buy tickets and show up to the games, he has that prerogative. But this doesn't rise to the level of illegality here. And I'm not going to be the moral arbiter for other people's lives. I have my own belief set, and there's things I believe are right and wrong, but that's not for me to impress those views upon other people and tell people to make decisions based upon this. But this is unrelated to the signing of Tim Tebow and anything else. And we hear these rumblings within the locker room. We'll see how they play on Sunday. They come out inspired and play tough. He hasn't lost the locker room. I think Shad Khan will probably keep him. If they don't play inspired, well, then I think Shad Khan has some decisions to make. But everything else is between Urban and his family. And he has to deal with those consequences of the decisions he's made. But there's a lot of people that have done bad things that are really good at their job. The problem is that Urban's 0-4 this year. They had just lost a game to Cincinnati. If they had won that game, I think him being out, what happened being out is irrelevant to this, but it's a lot of it, the fact that him being out, not flying back. If you win, then you say you gave everybody the weekend off for the win, but they had a 2-touchdown lead and they didn't close the deal. And now that's why we're seeing this play out. And they've lost 19 in a row, and 15 of them were from the prior year, but it doesn't matter. You're wearing that all together. And so it's all of the critical mass that is just built up over this point. I don't think Shad Khan makes a change. I think he's heavily invested in this unless the team completely derails, which I do not see happening. The bigger thing is, and people are worried about losing the locker room. To me, it's losing your coaches, because great head coaches, whether it's Bill Belichick, Parcells, Urban Meyer, Saban, a lot of these guys are really, really hard on their staff, and your staff has to believe in you, and they have to believe that you're working together towards a common goal, and that they're going to have job security, because you still have your job and the fact you want them there, and you're selling them on all this stuff and grinding and working hard. You have to wonder whether people have like one eye, on the horizon and talking to their friends around the league and front office about potential openings other places when the season's over. That is the bigger question for me, is can he get the staff to buy back in? If he can get the leaders in the locker room to buy in, which I think most of the players aren't necessarily looking at this and blowing up at it and saying that this is something that's going to, completely derail the team. But I do think it could end up being the coaches and some of the front office staff and people there that you've asked to buy in and asked to do it, a certain way for you. So I think that's possibly the bigger situation that we'll have to see how it comes out down the road and shakes out. But we'll see on Sunday, how they look and see moving forward. And I'm inclined to think that this thing will be okay. I can't guarantee that, but we live in a news cycle now where it's boom, boom, boom. We're going to rain, 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 pour, pour, pour until the next thing. And so sometimes it's just about surviving the storm, but winning will cure all of it and be able to kind of rectify some of this professionally. Personally, it's a whole nother deal. That wraps this up. Thanks for listening. Carp's Corner.